The date, April 12, 1861. The sound of gunfire cut the spring air. It rolled across the water from a little island off the coast of South Carolina, Fort Sumter. In the bustling city of Atlanta, the dogwoods splashed white over the landscape. Farmers talked of bumper crops from King cotton. No sounds of gunfire here. But before many more springs, the thundering echoes of Sumter would roll across the red clay hills of Georgia. And when the thunder was finally silenced, a history would remain written with the lives and sacrifices of gallant souls on both sides. On April 10, 1862, the war came to Georgia. Union forces bombarded and captured Fort Pulaski near Savannah. Georgia's first taste of battle, defeat. The fort would be used by the North to block Savannah Harbor for the duration of the war. On April 12, more sounds of war, not the sound of cannon fire, but the shriek of a steam whistle. It's early morning. The big steam engine called the General is hauling supplies and people up the Western and Atlantic from Atlanta to Chattanooga. Big Shanty Station is the stop for breakfast. While the riders are having their morning meal, a startling thing occurs. Without warning, the General moves away from the station with a new crew aboard now, 20 Federal raiders and their commander, Captain James J. Andrews, a Union spy, stealing the train from right under the noses of the passengers and crew. Andrews has orders to destroy rails, bridges, telegraph lines, and tunnels to cut this railroad to pieces, destroying Chattanooga's main supply line to the south. Captain W.A. Fuller is the original conductor of the General. Immediately, he and his crew set out from the station on foot in hot pursuit of the locomotive. A nip-and-tuck chase winds up the tracks of the Western and Atlantic toward Chattanooga. Andrews and his raiders bluff their right-of-way along the line, tricking southbound trains into letting them through. And pressing the chase, Captain Fuller, vaulting from one piece of rolling transport to another, whatever he could get, first a push cart, then a switch engine to a troop train, and finally aboard the engine Texas, which continues the chase in reverse. By the time Andrews and his raiders reach Calhoun, they know their pursuers are hot on their trail. Even as the General pulls out of the north end of Calhoun, Fuller and the Texas are racing toward the south end. As he hears the whistle of the Texas screaming at his heels, Andrews abandons all hopes of further destruction to the line, his only concern now to outrun Fuller. But the running of the General is about over. By now she's out of fuel and her water is dangerously low. Just past Ringgold, Andrews and his men abandon the train and flee to the woods. Their train is gone, their luck is gone, the chase is over. Andrews and his raiders are captured, and Captain W.A. Fuller, who tackled the impossible, has won. Again the following spring, 1863, another Union force sets its sights on the same rail line, but in attempting to reach it, suffered equal defeat. Colonel Abel D. Strait and his cavalry troop were surrounded and captured near Rome after a 9-day chase through the hills of North Alabama by Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest. Another taste of war for Georgia, but this mere hint of conflict was soon to burst into staggering reality. The date, September 19, 1863, the Battle of Chickamauga. The Indians had named it well, Chickamauga, River of Death. Union General Rosecrans had crossed the Georgia line at Chattanooga. It was General Braxton Bragg's job to drive him back again, and the waters would run red with blood in Chickamauga Creek. Bragg's forces pushed the Federals away from the rambling front along Chickamauga and drove them back through Chattanooga. But victory for the Confederates was short-lived. The battles at Lookout Mountain, Missionary Ridge, and Chattanooga drove them down from their heights above the city. This new drive by the Union forces was a historic prelude, the prelude to a great and bloody drive to the south. Nothing would stand in its way until, like a hurricane, it would run its course, leaving in its wake a scar that would remain for generations. The North's campaign was destined to hold center stage of the war for many months to come. Its leading man would be William Tecumseh Sherman, Major General, U.S. Army, aged 44, a red-bearded West Pointer, a brilliant soldier who made few mistakes on the battlefield. Under his command, 3 armies totaling 98,000 men, most of them battle-tested veterans. On April 4, 1864, Sherman received the following orders from General U.S. Grant, Commander-in-Chief of the Union forces. You are proposed to move against Johnston's army, to break it up, and get into the interior of the enemy's country as far as you can. Success for Sherman would mean the capture of Atlanta and the severing of supply lines to General Lee in Virginia. But standing between Sherman and the interior of Georgia stood the Confederate Army of the Tennessee, some 42,000 men, and a determined commander in Joseph E. Johnston, a man whom Sherman himself rated second in ability only to Robert E. Lee. Although outnumbered 2-1, Johnston was counting on delaying tactics to make the invaders commit one mistake that would prove fatal. For if he could delay Sherman long enough, Johnston felt the war-weary North would defeat Lincoln in the November presidential elections and then make overtures of peace to the Confederacy. But Sherman respected Johnston too much to make a direct assault. Instead, he planned to use his manpower advantage by thrusting a strong force against the rebel lines and then sending an army of men around their flank, forcing them to retreat to new positions. Thus the battle plans were drawn. The giant chess game had begun. The first move came at Rocky Face Ridge near Dalton. Sherman deployed a main force against the Confederate forces and sent General McPherson's troops flanking south, then east, hoping to catch the entrenched rebels from behind. Johnston had a small force of Confederates which met McPherson's advance guard at Resaca, forcing the Union leader to halt and dig in. Meanwhile, Confederate reinforcements arrived from Mississippi, led by General Leonidas Polk, to serve as a rear guard until Johnston pulled back. On May 13, 1864, Sherman, following up his advantage, ran up against a well-entrenched Johnston at Resaca. For 2 days, the rebels inflicted heavy losses on the Union forces, but again, Sherman's flanking movement forced Johnston back to a stronger position. He selected Cassville, a small town near the Etowah River, as the spot. But some of his subordinates, of which General Hood was the most vocal, felt the position was too open to Northern artillery, and so the weary rebels pulled back again, this time toward Ackworth and westward to Dallas. Sherman, who had traveled the area before the war, knew the Allatoona mountain range and was resolved not to cross it. Therefore, he routed his troops southwest of the range through Dallas. Again, the flanking maneuver moved Federal forces forward slowly, relentlessly toward Atlanta, and patiently, Johnston waited for battle on his terms. The chess game continued. The Confederates' main force, entrenched at New Hope Church, was attacked in a blinding rainstorm by Union forces under the command of Fighting Joe Hooker, who suffered heavy losses. For 3 days, the Southerners fought furiously in the vicinity, but the superior numbers across the battle line thrust them back into a new defensive position, a chain of isolated hills, Pine Mountain, Lost Mountain, and in the middle, Kennesaw Mountain. And from overhead, the gray sky let loose a torrent of rain, turning the battlefield into a muddy swamp. Roads became impassable. Trenches became creeks. Supply lines were halted. There was nothing either side could do but wait. Johnston welcomed the rain. His back was to Atlanta. The bad weather gave him a much-needed chance to regroup his weary forces, to dig in, to set a plan to stop Sherman's onslaught. The days gave Sherman some time to think, too. He decided to send his troops through Kennesaw over Johnston's positions. It would save valuable time and crush the morale of the rebels. This turned out to be the biggest mistake Sherman would make during the war. Sherman decided to dig in and fight it out, which was exactly what Johnston wanted. On June 27, 1864, the bloody Battle of Chickamauga ensued. And when the smoke had cleared, Sherman's mistake had cost him 3,000 men. Johnston lost 1,000. Sherman's direct assault had failed. So again he resumed his policy of flanking movements. Swinging far to the right, Sherman threatened the vital Confederate communications. The rebels again had no choice but to abandon the mountains around Marietta and retreat. Turning his thoughts away from the bloody slopes of Cheatham's Hill, General Johnston made ready for his next tangle with the relentless Sherman. It would be in the valley of Peachtree Creek, well within striking distance of Atlanta. At this very critical time, a blow was thrust upon Johnston which rocked the general and his forces. On July 17, 1864, Johnston received the following communication. Lieutenant General J.E. Johnston. Lieutenant General J.B. Hood has been commissioned to the temporary rank of general. I am directed by the Secretary of War to inform you that as you have failed to arrest the advance of the enemy to the vicinity of Atlanta and express no confidence that you can defeat or repel him, you are hereby relieved from command of the Army and Department of Tennessee. Signed, S. Cooper, Adjutant and Inspector General. Johnston was out, and so was his keen strategy. In his place, General J.B. Hood. The move met with the approval of General Sherman, for he felt Hood was no match. 2 days after he took command, Hood engaged the Union forces. The place, Peachtree Creek. The date, July 20, 1864. With some element of surprise to Sherman's troops, now across the creek in force, a column of rebels burst through the woods and stormed the Federals. The battle was short but desperate. When the guns were silent again, both sides counted their dead and wounded. The Northern losses were placed at over 1,700. For the South, over 4,000. And just beyond and to the south by a very few miles, Sherman's objective, Atlanta. The Battle of Atlanta is here. Sherman is poised and ready to tighten his fist around the city and crush it to death. The plans are set into motion. Union General Thomas will press toward Atlanta from the north. General Schofield will move eastward and directly on to Decatur. General McPherson will move due east along the Georgia Railroad toward Decatur and Stone Mountain, destroying track and cutting telegraph lines. McPherson hits the railroad just 4 miles from the mountain. With Union troops pressing about him from many sides, General Hood decides to use one of Sherman's own flanking maneuvers. It is July 21. With one force under Stuart holding against Thomas to the north and Cheatham's corps facing east along the Georgia Railroad, Hood orders a night march of Hardee's corps. They leave their positions north of the city and march due south through the center of Atlanta and beyond, then a sharp loop back to the north and east, completely around McPherson to smash him from the rear. At the same time, Cheatham's corps must move east along the railroad to trap McPherson, while Stuart's rebel force plans to hold Thomas to the north. Dawn of July 22 finds the plans of General Hood beginning to fall apart. Hardee's men, due to attack at dawn, are delayed until noon before they can strike. The delay also ruins the element of surprise. At the same time, the Federals are moving up reinforcements to cover their flank. But the battle is on. Immediately, the Confederates gain headway. Cheatham presses on, almost splitting the Union Army of the Tennessee, and rebels press the Union forces rear and front. Sherman sees the Southern advance and calls up reinforcements to throw the rebels back. The fierce fighting is now hand to hand. Though the Confederates have losses in East Atlanta, there are gains in Decatur when General Joe Wheeler's troops swoop down on Federal troops entrenched there and drive them out of town and to the north. Time moved slowly in Atlanta, and the hours were dark for General Hood. He had lost his rail lines to the north and east, and on July 28, Sherman moved his troops down the west side of the city to cut off the railroad to Montgomery. Hood sent troops to stop him. It was called the Battle of Ezra Church. The fighting raged all through the afternoon, but the odds against the rebels were too great. Hood's forces fell back into the inner defenses of the city. And what of the city? Sherman had almost surrounded it, and now he aimed his cannon at its very heart and fired. The bombardment began in the last days of July and continued through most of August. Many townspeople evacuated, but others remained and tried to carry on some semblance of routine in spite of the shelling. Suddenly, on Thursday, August 25, 1864, the onslaught stopped. Although rumors flashed about that Sherman was retreating, this was only wishful thinking, for Sherman was shifting his attention to the only railroads still in Southern hands, the Macon and Western and the Atlanta and West Point to the south of the city, the final link in the chain to shackle Atlanta. When Hood heard that the Union forces had cut the rails, he sent 2 corps to meet the troops at East Point and Jonesboro. The result was near catastrophe for the Confederacy. With the last railroad in Union hands, Hood knew the city could no longer be held, and on August 31, a new preparation was made: evacuation. At sundown on September 1, the rebel forces were nearly all out of Atlanta. The people could hardly believe what was happening. 1 cavalry unit stayed behind on Hood's orders to blow up a huge trainload of ammunition, 7 steam engines, and the Confederate rolling mills. For 5 hours, flames streaked high into the sky, and violent explosions shook the city, a blazing, thundering finish to one of the most famous conflicts of the entire war. On September 2, 1864, a weary man took a memorandum pad from his pocket and scrawled these words: To Brigadier General Ward, Commandant 3rd Division, 20th Corps. Sir, the fortune of war has placed Atlanta in your hands. As mayor of the city, I ask protection to non-combatants and private property. Signed, James M. Calhoun, Mayor of Atlanta. The battle for Atlanta was over. The Confederacy was dying. Hood, now in Macon, makes a desperate move. He swings his forces north again, but well west of Atlanta, up the Western and Atlantic Railroad, hoping to cripple Sherman's supply line and draw him out of the city. Sherman did give chase, but when Hood turned his troops west at Resaca and then to Alabama, Sherman changed tactics. He sent General Thomas up to Nashville to engage Hood's advance into Tennessee. He then brought his own force back to Atlanta. Now Sherman set about preparations for his momentous march to the sea. He selected 60,000 of his best men, and on November 15, 1864, with the ruins of the city behind him, Sherman's troops began the march. He split his forces into 2 wings, one under the command of General Howard moving down through Jonesboro and Gordon, the other under General Slocum, circling out through Decatur, Stone Mountain, Covington, Madison, and Eatonton. At the state capitol at Milledgeville, Slocum's troops barely missed the state officials who had evacuated the city only a short time before. At Sandersville, the two wings joined forces again and pushed for Savannah. Wheeler's cavalry, retreating before Sherman's forces, gave small resistance, but Sherman rolled on. Waynesboro, Davisboro, Louisville, and Millen, Statesboro, Little Ogeechee River, and finally the Union troops came to the end of the line, Savannah. The last big obstacle remaining between Sherman and the sea was Fort McAllister on the mouth of the Ogeechee River near Savannah. The rebels defended gallantly, but they were greatly outnumbered. Defending the city was General Hardee and 15,000 troops. After holding the city for 10 days, Hardee realized the futility of the situation and pulled back into South Carolina, literally giving the city to Sherman. It was December 24, 1864. Sherman had reached the sea. It took 37 days and cost the state 300 miles of railroad and $100 million in property damage. In one of his first official acts, General Sherman sent a telegram to President Lincoln. It read in part, "I beg to present you as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah." It would be 5 months before Governor Brown would officially surrender the state. But for all practical purposes, the war was over for Georgia. With the fall of Macon and Columbus in early 1865, Georgia found herself under the flag of the United States for the first time in 4 years. 4 long years of death, destruction, and veritable annihilation. But out of the ashes grew a new Georgia built on the spirit of those who sacrificed. And as Georgia moves on to greater days, she does so knowing the same spirit prevails. Today there are new ideals, and there are brave and forward-looking individuals to preserve them. The spirit that wrote Georgia's history continues to shape the destiny of her future.